Welcome to Connecting to Admired Leadership, where twice a month we explore the behaviors and routines that make great leaders extraordinary. I'm Wes Bender, and I have the distinct pleasure of hosting some of our firm's partners, coaches, and clients to discuss leadership in ways you won't hear anywhere else. Let's dive into this episode and make people and situations better together. But our guest today, Katie, and I were talking earlier this week that there's a good number of leaders who run so hard every single day, every single week, every single month that that when their bodies slow down, that's typically a time they get sick. And I've been thinking about that as there are plenty of germs, we say, running around this time of year. I know the flu's going around. My wife's had walking pneumonia as well, and for me, when I slow down, I can tell I'm getting sick, and usually it starts with my voice. And I was telling Katie this week, my voice is starting to go. So hope all of you take care of yourself. As for me, I've got just a small glass of hot tea and honey that I'm going to be hitting and curling up with my favorite holiday movie as well. So in order to get us kick-started in that spirit, we'd love to know who's on the call with us live today. So if you would, drop in the chat box who you are, where you're from, and your favorite holiday movie. This is the last of this year's 2024 series of webinars that we've been doing. I couldn't imagine a better topic to close the year on as we move into the holidays and we look at relationships and people we've invested in this year, people we want to invest in the next year as well. It's going to be a great topic for us to dive into, and I couldn't think of a better person to close us out for the year either. Katie really leans in to our very working definition of admired leadership is leaders are people who walk into a room, they walk into a space, they jump on a virtual call, and they make the people and the situation better for their presence being there. And that's how we very simply define leadership. And Katie is absolutely one of those people in our world, in our firm, and of course, all of the clients that she works with as well. Just a quick overview of admired leadership. If you're not familiar, thank you guys so much for dropping in the chat box there. Oh, planes, trains, and automobiles from Rich. I had to stop and give that one a shout out for sure. This will be interesting to see everybody's holiday movies come in. Just a quick overview. I was reminded this week we were at the Learning Conference down in Orlando, Florida, and one of our colleagues, Eric Springer, and I led a session centered around leadership is not just knocking goals out of the park and performing at a high level. Leadership is also not just building great culture or making people feel good. Leadership is both of those things. Leadership is what we say performance and followership. You walk into a room, you make the people in situations better because you are fueling all the performance metrics that your organization calls for. And at the same time, you are stirring intrinsic motivation. You're stirring energy and enthusiasm in people to get behind that at the same time. The space we play in a very saturated leadership development market, the sandbox, kind of the preeminent sandbox that we have, is high utility, very practical, very behavioral based. We are loving more and more people kind of jumping on this and seeing the value in this as well. So with that, let me have our guest introduce. This is your second time to be on our webinars. Katie, thank you for joining us. Who are you and what are you currently loving about what we get to do each day? Who are you? What are you currently loving about what we get to do each day?
Well, first, thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody who has joined. I know this time of year is particularly hard to find time for yourself because we're all charging so hard and so fast. But my name is Katie Angstadt. I'm a partner at CRA Admired Leadership, and I'm based in the Philadelphia area. Just to give you a little sense of my geography, because I know we have people all over the country, and even probably some folks who are outside of the country. What am I loving about the work that we do this week? I love this time of year. It's fast, it's furious, but I find myself, I spend a lot of time working with executives and leaders as their coach and on projects related to changes that they're implementing in their organizations. And there's a forcing mechanism to this time of year, which is an opportunity to really reflect, think about the things that went well, think about the opportunities that you want to work on for next year as you get better. And so I'm finding myself in a lot of those conversations And there's really moments of revelation for a lot of the leaders to say like, wow, I really accomplished a lot this year, a lot to be proud of. Because I think so often, especially high performing leaders are so focused on what didn't I do well? What do I need to do better next year? And so being able to take part in those conversations and really force that reflection through questions gives me a lot of energy and hope and excitement and enthusiasm for the year ahead.
That's awesome. I love that. And you mentioned you might kind of speak to that earlier this week when we talked, but when you said it that time, I don't know, it was even more heartwarming for sure. And I really believe that for sure. I'm going to drop in the chat box for those of you who would like. That is our today's kind of field note that's going to guide our conversation. So when I invite our partners and our guests to jump on with me, I always ask them, what's a piece of our content that really resonates with you? And a lot of times they'll send us one of our field notes. We have daily field notes that go out every single day, 365 days throughout the year. These are great little bite-sized leadership nuggets of really pure gold. They're high utility, high practicality. If you're not a subscriber, you can click that link. You'll be able to read today's field note that we're going to be talking about, but you'll also be able to subscribe moving forward. That's the best way for you and your team, for really you and your social surrounding, you and your family. It's pretty cool right now. I have weekly conversations now with my son, who's 17 years old and is now a subscriber to Field Notes, and my dad. So both ends of the generation, we have conversations, and it's all centered around leadership. Really, really cool stuff. So as we frame this, of course, we mentioned one of the things I always hear, Katie, is when we talk to what we might call legacy leaders, leaders who have just made a huge impact within their organization for a good long time, and their tenure's coming to an end. Perhaps they're retiring. What we hear a lot when we ask them, what are you thinking about as this time comes? It's often we hear little about strategy, revenue, growth, and we hear a lot about relationships for sure. And there is no question that relationships, we have an entire module centered around that in our online codex, which we have. It is centered around relationships. How do the best leaders in the world really get strategic about relationships? How do they invest in those? So could you just frame that up maybe a little bit more for us? At the same time, we've had a lot questions come in ahead of time. Unfortunately, there's no way we're going to get to all those, but we're going to get to some of those. We also happy to take great questions from the chat box as we go along to see if we have time for those too. So frame this kind of conversation up a little bit more as we look to who are we going to invest in related to relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I love that field note. It's actually one of my favorite field notes. What relationships do I need to invest in? And I'll just maybe hit some of the high points of that in case you haven't had a chance to read it just yet. But encourage you to do so after the conversation here. And again, like Wes had said, they're bite-sized, so it shouldn't take you long. But it's really this idea of, as you think about your career and the different stages of your career, whether you're newer in your career, kind of mid-cycle, midlife, or as you're thinking about, the final years as you think about retirement or you think about what's next. I think so often in our culture, we're so accustomed to thinking about all the things that we have to do and get done to be successful, the goals that we have. And so we take stock of that performance. And we have different measures of what success looks like at every stage of our career and every chapter that we have. And what we find is relationships are really most often overlooked. And we find the best leaders, the most admired leaders spend a lot of time and discipline and energy thinking about not just their goals and what they need to do, but the relationships they need to be successful, the relationships that they maybe need to dissolve because they're hindering their success or what have you. And so this idea that how can we be more disciplined and thoughtful and strategic about our relationships, recognizing the fact that our ability to be able to get things done really does depend on having solid relationships in place. And especially when we get busy, relationships tend to get overlooked, right? It's not until we, close the project, hit the deadline, deliver the final memo or whatever the case may be that we pick our head up and say, okay, let me think more thoughtfully about my relationships. Or we're not even thinking about them, but we're recognizing, oh man, that relationship probably isn't where it needs to be. That's usually the leading indicator of like, oh shoot, They're not responding to me, or I'm getting a cold shoulder, or something's not going well. And so at that point, it's like, is it too late? What do I have to do to help get that relationship back into the black or the green, as it were? And so our whole thinking around this is like, what are the best leaders doing as they think about relationships? And how can we make sure that we are spending the right time on the right relationships? Because at the end of the day, time is the great equalizer. We all have the same amount of it, and how we spend it counts. And so we need to be really thoughtful about how we invest that time and energy, and recognizing that it's highly symbolic to our ability to get things done.
Yeah. I'm going to tee you up with the first question that we got ahead of time. How do you determine which relationships hold the most importance? And as you think about that for a second, I'm reminded very recently I was talking to a leader, and she's a CEO of a large nonprofit that does food insecurity for families in Atlanta, Georgia. And she said, sometimes there's just some EGRs that you got to stop interacting with. And I said, EGR, what do you mean? She said, well, those are extra grace required folks that are just sucking your time like crazy.
Yeah.
And I thought about that, and I thought, the best leaders in the world, they step away and take time to assess where they're pouring energy into. Because sometimes we can do that just subconsciously and we don't even know. So here's a good way to tee up that question that we got ahead of time, which is a good one. How do you determine which relationships hold the most importance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what we found, and what we see is naturally to think about. I think so often we think about relationships around like who makes us feel good, like who are the people that we really enjoy being around, who gives us energy.
Yeah.
To story you just shared, what's the opposite? Who's sucking my energy out? Who's depleting my energy? How do I spend less time with them? Because we know those people when we see them. But this question is really in the professional sense, I think, is really around how can we be more strategic with our time,
Yeah.
and determining really where do I want to invest more time and energy with particular people. And so I think from my perspective and from our perspective, it's really important to understand kind of what your goals are, not just, the SMART goals that you're measuring and being compensated against or measured against, but your goals individually for your career path and what you want for your next step in your profession, and within the organization that you're working. And so I think the question around, what are your goals and how do you want to grow professionally? And what are the relationships that would be valuable to helping or hindering your success? And so as you think about that, this is a really great time of year to take stock on that and to say like, okay, what are those most critical relationships that if I think about what my goals are that are going to help or hinder my success, and how do I carve out more time for the ones that I think are most important? And I think, how we define importance is different from person to person.
Yeah.
If you're really looking for some clear, there's lots of different dimensions that you can consider, but sometimes I think it's about relevance. So the relevance of your work to that person, or the relevance of their work to you to be successful. Do you have dependencies between you that you need them to be successful and they need you to be successful? If you have someone that there's reciprocity there, that's probably someone who has high relevance, which means it's
Mm.
probably somebody you need to invest in and be more thoughtful about. I also think an important dimension can be, particularly in organizations which are hierarchical in nature, is their level of influence.
Hmm.
So if you have someone that their level of influence in the organization, they're a key opinion leader, people look to them, they defer to them when big decisions are being communicated. I think it's important that you understand that level of influence is an important factor as you consider what are those key relationships. And equally so, if you have someone who's of high relevance and high influence, I think those are the sorts of relationships that you need to prioritize and say, okay, how am I making sure that I'm carving out the right time and energy? And you'll have people who are of high influence, but maybe of lower relevance. And so those might be relationships that you say, I don't need to spend nearly as much time. But at the end of the day, you only have so much time and energy in your life. And there's research around how many relationships can you sustain over time. And the social world in which we live allows it to be a bigger pie, if you will. But I think about the meaningful relationships and the ones that you want to engage in with most, being really thoughtful about how would you define importance? But those are just some examples of dimensions that you could apply as you think about level of importance.
That's good. I love that. There's a X and Y axis chart that's in development right there, right?
Yep.
Relevance and influence for sure. And it would be an interesting exercise for us all to kind of step back and chart our current relationships, related to all of that. The other thing I heard you say that I've never heard is we've talked about this in our firm before, which is part of the reason I love doing these webinars so much, because always some new learning that I get to have, even though I'm around our content all the time. But I love what you said that who is important to build relationship with may be different for everybody in certain times. So what I heard you say is taking that step back and saying, okay, what is most important to me right now? And that needs to be a huge driver for how I classify whether people are ones that I truly want to invest in, for sure. I'm reminded recently, and I always try to make sure people understand our work is centered around you being a better leader professionally, but our work makes such a huge difference in our personal lives at the same time. So very recently, I was voluntold to be the PTA president of my daughter's middle school, which is not something I wanted to
Congratulations.
touch. But yeah, congratulations. Yeah, not no. But it's not something I want to touch with a 10-foot pole. Any of you've ever been around, PTA and public education, everything. But I'll tell you that when I did that, I realized, it's real important for my daughter in middle school to have a great experience. And those are going to be great relationships that I'm going to be able to form. So I really did some intentionality of pouring into those relationships. And it's paid off dividends, right? Because what's most important to me and my family right now makes these relationships very, very relevant to me. And so therefore, I do spend extra energy, even with some EGRs that we have at our public middle school too. There is no doubt about that as well. But with that, where our firm really shines is being able to take these principles. Do we need to build better relationships? Absolutely. How do we do that? One level deeper. Well, we need to step back and realize what's important to us and prioritize which relationships we need to be investing in. But our firm always takes that one more deeper and says, how do the best leaders in the world then do that? And I love this question that came in ahead of time. How do the best leaders track and engage key relationships, in order to really build a larger network of relationships that they're pouring into? Now we're getting into a lot of our really good content. That's a lot behind our codex, on our online and everything. But give people a taste. How do the best leaders track and engage key relationships?
Yeah. So I would say that they are really thoughtful and deliberate and spend a good amount of time thinking about relationships. I often say, in our experience, when we think about all of the leaders that we've worked with, we've kind of what we found in our own research and in our own conversations and shared experiences is leaders tend to think about the world in two lenses. The first lens is, what are all the problems that I have to solve and the issues and the roadblocks and the challenges that I have, and all natural, a very natural thing to be thoughtful about when you're a leader, because those are the things that impede your ability to be successful. But the other lens that they often think through is the relationships that they need. And what are
Mhm.
the relationships that I have to be successful, to remove those roadblocks, to create the right environment for my team to be successful? And so, what admired leaders do and the most effective leaders do is that they spend a lot of time thinking thoughtfully about them, planning for them, setting goals for relationships. And then they spend time actually being thoughtful about how they're going to invest that time, and they track it. So I think that question was really interesting. I'm curious if, for whoever the person was that sent it in, the language that they used around tracking, and they used our language around dripping, which is
Yeah.
really interesting. But the way that we think about tracking is, if you were to take stock of those relationships, I mean, how many people don't do this, and sometimes it can feel a little bit counterintuitive or disingenuous to kind of say, like, okay, well, I'm going to write down all my relationships and kind of see where do I think they are right now? How's this relationship going? Is it where I want it to be? What does a goal look like for this time next year? Where do I hope this relationship is? What do I want that to look like? What are the types of conversations I want to be having with that person? And for any of you who were able to join the session that I led last time, we talked about this idea that relationships are really the direct result of the conversations that you have. We often
Mm.
say everything happens because of or within a conversation. And so if you're thinking to yourself, wow, I really want to improve that relationship, one of the levers that you can pull is change the conversation. what are you talking about? What's the tone that you're taking? How are you engaging with that person? If you the crux of your relationship is you send text messages all the time, well, it's going to be a little constrained in how deep that relationship can actually go. So, having variety in your relationships in how you take risks. So the best leaders are very thoughtful in writing down who are those the relationships that I really want to prioritize this year. What are the goals that I have for those relationships? Where do I want them to move? And what are the immediate next things that I want to do to move that relationship? Maybe it's, increasing the frequency of connection that I have with that person over the course of the year. Right now, maybe we only meet once or twice or see them, a handful of times over the course of the year. Maybe I need to up that because we know that more frequency actually creates deeper relationships faster. So I think being really thoughtful about not only what you're talking about, but your frequency and how you're staying connected with them. And I think with regard to how we engage, that engagement question, which is this is a twofer, right? That second part, which is how do we make sure we're engaging, is the distinguishing factor is really around this idea of relationships are built on reciprocity. Right. If I do something for you, you're going to do something for me. It's in a sense, I have the ball and I throw it to you and then you throw it back to me. Because if it's one-sided for too long, then that relationship probably isn't going to accelerate the way you need it to. And what creates that reciprocity is usually our ability to be able to really add value to other people. If I'm adding value to someone in the relationship and they're finding value in our relationship and they're feeling like their tank's getting full or they're energized, they're going to be more inclined to be reciprocal back to me and want to invest in me. And so I often say that when we think about what the best leaders do is they recognize this idea of reciprocity, they recognize this importance of adding value. And then the other thing I would say is that they're deeply curious about others and engaging them in conversations that don't just serve as a point in time, but rather how am I going to create that conversation over time and create that continuity so that it feels like there's more frequency when in fact there maybe even may not be. So I just said a lot right there. So let
Ooh,
me
and
just
you just, I mean, there are, I wish we had an hour instead of 8 minutes just to unpack that gold that you just said. I'm also going to drop in the chat box. You referenced your webinar that you were on from October 11th. I'm dropping that link in the chat box for those of you who might be interested in that and going back to listen. So there's some great things there too. Also, if you're dropping things in the chat box, I don't know if you see, we're getting some great comments from some people who are live. So if you're dropping that in the chat box, make sure you're sharing that with everyone, not just the host and panelist, if you can, because some of those things are really, really great and would love to hear from that. Let's go to this last question because I think it's really good too. And we did get a lot of questions that kind of centered around this, which is how do you deprioritize a relationship when it's no longer needed or of value? Which relationships shouldn't leaders invest in or avoid altogether? You kind of answered that second question already a little bit, but how do you determine, man, I gave this person so much time this last year, and I do not need to give them that much time next year based on relevance and importance. How do I begin deprioritizing that?
yeah. I mean, I think
And what if it's your family member? No, just play.
we all have one. We all have one. Let's be honest. That's always a good question. I think what tends to happen is there's less of a I'm going to deprioritize that where I put a stake in the ground and I make that conscious decision. And it's more of like those things just kind of happen to fade over time. So I do think actually going through that exercise to say, okay, if I'm thinking about the relationships that are most important, asking yourself that question of, what are the ones that I do need to deprioritize? I think the other thing that is worth mentioning that is important to keep in mind that we see the best leaders do is they anticipate relationships that they might need in the future. So while it may not necessarily be a relationship I need today, it may be a relationship that they need to have in 6 months or a year or 2 years, and they're going to start to cultivate that relationship before they need it. And so I think it's important not only to think about that, but I think asking yourself that question to say, like, what are those relationships? But the how is really important. And some may be just like, I'm going to deprioritize that and I'm going to let that fade into the distance. Maybe you've been the pursuer and you're not getting the reciprocity that you want. And so maybe you say to yourself, okay, look, while I do still maybe need that relationship to achieve my goals, how can I get creative in having other people that I might invest in that could also help achieve that same goal or same outcome? We don't always have that luxury. There are times where there are people where you need the relationship. It's maybe not there, and despite your best efforts. So you have to get creative in how you think about those. But I think for some of them, it's, deprioritizing relationships. You need to deprioritize it because one, that person's, time or energy suck. Maybe there's a conflict of interest that you're thinking about from your professional responsibilities that prevents that concept, that conflict. And so maybe you think about, okay, how do I move away from that relationship without that person feeling like I'm moving away from it? And so that can be really tricky. And it's that old adage, we've all heard it, especially when we're growing up. And I have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. And I always talk to them about, you are the company that you keep. And
Yeah.
so you're in that transfers as adults too, right? Like if you're in a situation in your professional life and there are people that have, a bad brand or a bad reputation or gossip or are seen as negative, you have to be thoughtful about how you're situating yourself and determining, do I really want to continue to invest in that relationship? And how does that reflect on who I am, what my values are, what my brand is? And so I think understanding if a relationship is also compromising your values, is it building up your character and your performance and the performance of your team, or is it having the opposite effect?
Mm.
And then I think you have to decide everything has context. And so I could sit here and say to you, well, just stop engaging with that person. That's the easy thing to do. But I think being thoughtful about what does that need to look like? How do I transition that? Do I need any part of that relationship still? And if so, why? And how does that need to look? I think everyone going through that exercise is important as you think about, again, time is the great equalizer. It's elusive and we don't have enough of it. And if you say to yourself, I'm making a commitment to myself to invest in the things that are most meaningful and align with my values, and that includes all my relationships, I think you'll have some maybe eye-opening moments to say, like, this year, I'm not giving this person this much time of my time and energy. And there's lots of ways that you can do that. But I think the first step is just having that eyes wide open review to say, not going to do that this year. And instead, here's how I'm going to do it. Maybe I'm going to have someone on my team manage that relationship in a different way. Or maybe I'm going to just decide that I'm not going to go to those meetings anymore, whatever it may be. But I think small, right? What are the small changes that you can make in the relationship as opposed to just saying, well, I'm going to dissolve it and end it. That may be the case too, but I would give that some more thought and reflection before making any of those big decisions.
Katie, that was awesome. It was so good that I'm often, as the facilitator, of course, kind of looking at what comes after the conversation, the next question. And I absolutely got lost in exactly what you were saying because this time of year, looking at next year, it is so unbelievably important. And especially if you're leading a team, you're providing leadership to your family, to your spouse, to your husband, wife, to your parents, to your kids, across the board this concept of not just saying, yes, I need to be more intentional with my relationships, but being strategic with it and then getting down to those details of saying, how am I tracking and dripping this intentionality? And if you've never heard those terms before, those terms have been game changers for me since I became acquainted with our firm's content. That concept of tracking and dripping is incredible. I'm going to let you kind of collect and give final words of encouragement or anything to the leaders that we have on the call today. These 30 minutes always go by very, very quickly. I'm going to drop a couple things in the chat box. Again, there's just no way on these small webinars that we're able to get to all the questions, all the great thoughts and things. I am absolutely having the best time scheduling meetings with folks, talking some more about this, engaging them with some of our thought leadership. There's no cost to engage with that kind of stuff, and just a lot of the next opportunities that are coming up. So there's a link in there if you want to schedule a meeting. Then I'm very excited to say we have been for about a month now preparing a even larger, more robust string of events than we've even had this year. So we'll be doing these webinars even to a greater level. We already have a lot of those topics and partners that are jumping on and committing to those throughout the course of next year. We make those more widely available too, which is really, really exciting. In addition to that, our hope is that network of folks are driven. We're going to be doing 10 to 12, kind of bringing this webinar experience on the road, on location. We're going to be in DC next year. We're going to be in Atlanta, in Nashville, in Denver. We'll be in Houston, out in Texas, New York, Florida, Tampa. So we've got a lot of great spaces that we're going to be in, and we're really hoping to meet a lot of folks in person next year as well. So it's going to be really, really great. That's the link where you'll find as those become available, and they should launch just right as the new year comes open to solidifying a lot of that. Our last in-person event is going to be in Philly and Philadelphia on Wednesday. If you happen to be around that area, would like to know, just shoot me an email. You should have that from all the reminders as well. So, Katie, final words of encouragement, thoughts, insights as we kind of give everybody some great ideas and encouragement going into the holiday season.
Um, well, first, thank you for having me and for being on the call today. I just think that, your time is so precious and you are such a unique individual and you have so much to add in your relationships. And so making this time is you deserve that for yourself. And so I think this is a natural time of year to do that. And so I look forward to continuing to engage in these events and conversations. And I hope that everyone has a healthy and happy holiday season. And we look forward to a lot of these great events in 2025 and seeing all of you there.
I'm gonna go get my weighted blanket, refill my tea here, and curl up next to Die Hard this evening with the
Love
best
that.
holiday movie of all time. Thanks to it.
Awesome.
Katie, thanks as always. You're awesome. We'll see you next week in Philly. And thanks to everybody on the call, those of you listening to the recording as well. Stay tuned. Hope you join us for more in the new year. Happy holidays, everybody.
Thanks all.
Cheers. Bye.